I would imagine coming from England, he didn't quite feel it was his fight at the very beginning. But after battles like Antietam, troop loss on both sides, that's when Henry got actually drafted into the Army. And went on to some other famous places, Fredericksburg, Cold Spring. He was part of the group at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia when Lee surrendered. After the surrender, his regiment then escorted the surrender flag and the surrender sword of General Lee back to Washington. So he probably, you can say he was a part of history there. To get him to the Wenonah connection, if you will, how did he get to Wenonah? After the war, came back to Philadelphia and learned to be a locksmith. And he did business in Philadelphia and trained to be a locksmith for a number of years. Finally came to Wenonah probably around 1910 maybe. Started his own locksmith business in Wenonah. Certainly a very, very honored Civil War veteran. And to come back and have a normal life in Wenonah, New Jersey was pretty good.
My name was Lizzie Packer. My husband and I came from Connecticut. My husband, Elisha, and my brothers served in the Civil War with a Connecticut regiment. We moved to Pittman at that time, which made for a very easy ride on the train from Pittman into Philadelphia for that job. We lived there until his death and later my own in Pittman. There was no cemetery in Pittman at the time. That was the reason that we chose Wenonah for our final resting place. My brothers' names appear on our monument because they did die at quite a distance. Edwin died in California alone, save his wife of mere 3 years. William was a miner with a company in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. There was no known reason or motive that a fellow miner pulled a gun and shot him at close range, murdering him in 1891. Naturally, their bodies both lie in those locations, but we've left their memory here as well.
I was born in Barnesboro at a farm. I have one brother, who is buried in Eddington Cemetery over in Greenwich. No children. So I had 2 wives. One was 10 years younger than me, my first one, and my second one was 10 years older than me. So every year on my birthday, I'd open up my house to all the children in town, invite them in, and just tell the stories of the gray and the blue. I fought in 2 campaigns. I fought in Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. I was in the 28th New Jersey Volunteers, Company G. We were out of Freehold once we got mustered, sent to the Potomac to defend the White House. General Hooker thought that with Lee so close that we could actually break him because we were at a complement of about 130,000 men and he was only at 60,000 men. So unfortunately he outflanked us and we did not beat him. We then found out that Stonewall Jackson had a bigger piece of the battle and strategy than General Lee did, because once he left, although General Lee still had the chutzpah to do Gettysburg, he didn't have the strategy of Stonewall, and that's how we took Gettysburg.
Lemuel was born in Millville, and his parents and grandparents were also from Millville. And at 19 years old, he enlisted as a volunteer with the 24th New Jersey Infantry Regiment in Bridgeton. And when I read one of the articles about him, the ironic thing about it, Bridgeton at the time, September 24th, 1962, they had 382 volunteers in Bridgeton, coming from, that's the county of Cumberland. Now you can imagine when you go down that way now, it's very sparse. To have 386 volunteers was amazing. And it was the highest recorded volunteer enlistment in the country, except for one town in Haverhill, Massachusetts, that had a few more. Now, as a soldier, he enlisted in Bridgeton. Then they all marched down to the Bridgeton train station, and from there they took the train to Beverly, New Jersey, a camp called Camp Caldwell, which is near Beverly, New Jersey, up in Burlington County. And from there they were then dispatched to Philadelphia, and that whole regiment then left for Washington, D.C. That's when things were after, like the Battle of Manassas, The regiment, the New Jersey regiment, the 24th Infantry, was consolidated with a Pennsylvania regiment, and they fought at Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and also he was captured. The South didn't have enough munitions and rations to take care of their own troops, let alone take care of what prisoners. So there was a high mortality rate. And he died in 1920, and he's buried here. And I can't find out the connection, how he goes from Philadelphia and he brings his whole family here. I guess Wenonah Cemetery was even famous back then.
I'd like to introduce you to my husband, Joseph Bates. He was a sergeant in Company D, 24th Regiment, organized in Camp Caldwater, Beverly, New Jersey in September of 1862. The regiment was equipped with Belgian rifles and departed for Washington, going by steamer to Philadelphia and then by rail. He served the requested 9 months because at the time we were told that the war would be very short and 9 months would be adequate. The regiment was mustered out, paid, and returned to their homes. The total strength of the regiment was 994. The count included 5 resigned, 108 were discharged, 8 were promoted, 1 was transferred, and 8 deserted. 1 was not accounted for, and we had 92 deaths. So they mustered out 771. Joseph fortunately returned home in June 29, 1866. He was very proud to have served his country. When he came home, we met, we courted, we got married on December 23, 1866. We had 2 daughters, Reba and Elizabeth. Joseph was a carpenter by trade, and he worked in Camden locomotive yards. Unfortunately, on September 9, 1889, Joseph was struck and killed by a locomotive at the age of 49.
The infantry would later fight in the Battle of Cold Harbor, the Battle of Antietam, and he later got caught, captured at the Third Battle of Winchester. They would take an 18-day trek down to a post outside of Andersonville, which was probably about a half mile away from the gates. All the soldiers would be let out, and they would walk the wagon trail to the gates. He would have walked up and he would have seen 15-foot high stockade fencing with crow's nests all along the perimeter. He was there in September of 1864. So that was really probably one of the worst times that he could have been there, because that was the population of this prison camp was at around 34 to 35,000. It was originally built and meant to hold about 10,000 February earlier that year. It was 26 acres, and only about 20 of it were habitable. Because there was marshland, there was a creek that went through the middle, and there was also a 15-foot dead zone inside of the gate that was probably buried off by like split rail fencing, something like that. Then you had the stockade fence with the crow's nest. So starvation was rampant. Crime was actually rampant inside the camp. There was a group called the Raiders, and they were a rogue group of Union prisoners inside the camp that were terrorizing all the other ones. They would beat them up, take their clothes, take their shebangs, which was what they called their tents, and take them, sell it back to them, trade it for some sort of deed or whatever, some sort of work or something. So that's where he stayed from September until the prison camp was closed in May of 1865. He survived it. Andersonville claimed 13,000 lives, and that's just what was recorded inside the prison camp. After that, people were still dying from disease and things like that. He survived. He lived to be 74 years old. After Andersonville, he went up to Trenton, was discharged from his military responsibilities, and moved down here to Tanyard, where he had a farm.
I'm Josephine Miller. My husband, Captain Abraham Miller, and I are buried here in the Wenonah Cemetery. When I heard about this cemetery walk, I decided to come back to tell you some things about my husband. He was born in Camden in 1822. He left home at the age of 14 and went to work on the ship the Marlette Tilton in order to help care for his widowed mother. At the age of 18, he became the captain of his ship. During the Civil War, President Lincoln placed him on the USS Minnesota as fleet pilot. And this is a picture of the USS Minnesota. The Minnesota was a steam frigate and was one of the largest and most heavily armed vessels during the Civil War. It had been built in 1854 and was part of the East India Squadron. It visited Japan, China, and Hong Kong. It was decommissioned in 1859 and then was recommissioned in 1861 at the start of the Civil War. Following the Civil War, my husband worked for the Philadelphia and Reading Company for 20 years. He and I were married in 1865. I was about 25 years younger than he was, but I was fortunate to have his company for many years until his death in 1912. As you can see, he was in his 90th year at that time. We were listed in the 1900 and 1910 census records as residents of Wenonah.
The gentleman I'm going to be talking about today is interred right here. It's Benjamin W. Pierce, and he was a veteran of the Great War. Mr. Pierce was born in 1840, and he died in 1903 at the age of 63. At the age of 24, on September 3rd, 1864, we know that Benjamin Pierce enlisted in the New Jersey 2nd Cavalry Regiment and served in Company I. When he was mustered in, his unit was already in the field and again was stationed in Memphis, Tennessee, which had fallen to the Union. And by the beginning of April, this regiment became part of the last great campaign of the war, the Mobile Campaign. I want to say a little bit now about the man himself that we know from his life after the war. He'd been a school teacher for a time, but he gave that up. And he became involved in newspaper work and printing. He'd worked in Swedesboro for a time, and later on he moved to Woodbury because he needed to take care of his aged mother. And she lived in a very modest house in North Woodbury near what used to be the toll gate. Route 45 used to be a toll road, and there was a toll gate there. And he lived there quietly for the rest of his life. But although he left a quiet life, he was a man of great energy in serving his community. And he did so in many ways. He was a very active man. He was involved in the Swedesboro Masonic Lodge. He was a member of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. That was the great veterans organization for the Union soldiers that had 500,000 members at one time. He was, in fact, a member of the General Howell Post of that organization. He was a founder of the Gloucester County Historical Society and served as secretary for that organization, which still exists today. He was active in the County Sunday School Association, and as a prominent Baptist, he was clerk of something called the Baptist Association, which covered the entire Baptist churches of southern New Jersey. And according to his obituary in the Woodbury Times on March 27, 1903, he was engaged in philanthropic and temperance work. And the Woodbury Daily Times said, and I'll quote here, "He was a man of striking appearance and more than ordinary intelligence, and he kept himself well informed on all topics of general interest, having gathered around himself numbers of the leading volumes of periodicals of the day, of which he was fond."
Oh, I'm William Smith, but most people call me Billy. I was with Custer, but not exactly with Custer when he was wiped out. Custer divided his forces into 3 different columns. One column, which Custer was with, was right below the mountains. Sent the other one across the prairie, and I was in the column that went long by the river. Of course, those Indians came out of the mountain and wiped Custer completely out. The ones in the middle and us, it was all we could do to fight them off long enough to get back across the river and get some reinforcements, so they would have wiped us out too. I got wounded in the right arm here, can't do much with it. It's been a couple of years in the hospital out in the Midwest out there somewhere. They kept moving me around. Wound up living in 2nd Street over in Philadelphia. And most of my odd jobs are law enforcement type things. I was be a guard here and a guard there. Came over here, there was an amusement park in Paulsboro. And I wound up on the security force there for that amusement park. And then became the first probation officer for Gloucester County.
I had been a carpenter before the war, framing everything from outhouses to great fancy buildings. But after the war, I couldn't even lift my children, let alone sawhorses or framing timbers. My pa, who had died without having had the opportunity to remake his will without my name in it, had left me a small inheritance with which I intended to establish my own carpentry shop. But the world did smile at me in those days, and my prospects and work were good and getting better.
I was most distressed and dismayed when war at last broke out, and I turned away from it, refusing to read or talk about it. But the young men that I had befriended were all signing on, and I began to see it as my duty as well to enlist. In Beaufort, I took sick with dysentery and nearly died of diarrhea. Just as I began to mend, we were ordered to march north, and we engaged in many battles on our way to Gettysburg. On one occasion, as I hoisted a huge beam into position, I felt the flesh in my belly tear and saw my intestines pushing through. I had herniated, and the pain was so intense that I lost consciousness. By the time we arrived at Gettysburg, however, I had worsened considerably, and I could hardly stand up straight from the hernia. So I was sent to the infirmary, which likely saved my life because I missed the great battle which took place there. Most of my company were felled on that first day of fighting. When Anna died in 1893, I went to live in a home for disabled volunteer soldiers in Virginia, where I remained for nearly 20 years until my son George invited me to live with him in West Deptford for the remainder of my life. And so I moved north and collected a pension and sold the occasional bottle of laudanum. And that's my story, such as it is.